Ed Martin, president of the Phyllis Schlafly Eagles. It's good to be back with you again, and I invite you to please go to realmrsamerica.com and like and subscribe right below and pass this on, share with other people. We're trying to spread the truth about what Hollywood's doing and what the Mrs. America series on FX streaming on Hulu is doing. You know, we have to today talk about the very one thing that Mrs. America got right. Oh, we've been talking about all the things they got wrong. They got one thing right. But let's set the stage for that first, shall we? Take a look at all this. You know, this episode claims that Phyllis and Jill Ruckelshaus met for the first time in 1976. Well, unlike what they say in this script and what they say on the air, it wasn't Phyllis's first encounter with Jill Ruckelshaus. In fact, they debated many times before that period. And in fact, in 1973, Phyllis wrote in a contemporaneous account of all of these events in ERA. It's an extraordinary piece of data and information in this document. We have hundreds of pages in our Phyllis Schlafly Archives. Phyllis said that Jill was, quote, mighty cold in the exchange they had. And you know, on April 10th, 1976, and we think this may be what Mrs. America's referring to, Phyllis Schlafly and Jill Ruckelshaus did meet at the National Press Club. They kind of gave competing statements, and they didn't meet afterwards for drinks. That's made up as usual. And Phyllis wrote in that same contemporaneous account of the meeting, she wrote this, quote, Jill Ruckelshaus spent her time berating the press for covering me. In her distorted view of the world, Jill said that my views were unworthy of coverage and should not be reported. So much for the tolerance of the pro-ERAers. That's what Phyllis wrote about, and Phyllis was right. We have the tape of that meeting in our archives. You can listen to it. It doesn't really give a good impression of Jill Ruckelshaus, and it's certainly not what's true. Despite all these inaccuracies and these additions that Mrs. America makes out of whole cloth, here is one thing that they did get right.
Now, you and I both know that the ERA is not about equality. It's about power. And the left is making a power grab.
The Reagan Revolution is going to fail. Just like the Goldwater Revolution failed.
Goldwater didn't fail. He laid the groundwork.
There are more of us than there are of you.
ERA is all about power. That's what they say in Mrs. America. And Hollywood is right to admit that. It's very important. But it wasn't a power grab for Phyllis Schlafly, not at all. It was a power grab for the powers in Washington, D.C. A lot of them the men that you see depicted in the series, and a lot of women too, and mostly for the libbers. Phyllis Schlafly knew that women already had protections in America. She made a list of them. If you look at our archives, again, you can see these lists that Phyllis writes about. ERA would take away protections that women enjoyed in America, including in that list, I'm looking at one of those lists that Phyllis had, more breaks and better restroom facilities in jobs, especially industrial jobs. They had those protections in the 1970s. They would lose them to the ERA. Women had legal rights to be supported by their husband in all 50 states, and those would be eliminated by the ERA. They had a right, women had right to single-sex sports, single-sex schools, all-girls sororities, and colleges, universities. All of those things that were for women and that had been expanded over the decades before the ERA, they'd all be eliminated. Those protections would be gone. And, importantly, in the 1970s, women didn't have to register for the draft. They weren't going to be conscripted to die. They weren't going to be put in combat. They were protected from that. All those things would be lost. And the ERA people didn't want to talk about that. You know, Phyllis Schlafly was drawn to the fight over the ERA by a conservative friend of hers who said, I'll send you some of the writings about ERA. And Phyllis read in those early days an essay by a man named Warren Farrell. He was a pro-ERA professor, real liberal guy. And when Phyllis read that, she said, this guy is completely out of hand, because she saw Warren Farrell wrote this, quote, men should eagerly look forward to the day when they can enjoy free sex and not have to pay for it. He meant in marriage or any other way. The husband will no longer, she said, she wrote, Warren Farrell wrote, the husband will no longer, have to be saddled with the tremendous guilt feelings when he leaves his wife with nothing after she's given him her best years, end quote. That was what the pro-ERA people were pushing, and that's what Phyllis Schlafly saw. In other words, Warren Farrell and others agreed and admitted that the ERA would benefit men, not women. It would hurt women, and pro-ERAers admitted this. Now, if you don't believe that the ERA would just benefit men or was driven by a vision of doing something terrible to the family and to marriage and other things, you should look at who was funding the feminists in this fight. Because they made a big deal about implying that Phyllis Schlafly was funded by this group or that. It wasn't true. They looked at it for years and never found it. Wasn't a fact. It was a grassroots effort. But Mrs. America, they pretend that the feminists are fighting sexual harassment and the objectification of women. You know, it looks like that in there. And so some of them are really caring about women, kind of like today with some of the politics of the left and the Me Too movement. They say they're for protecting women and stopping sexual harassment, but only when it's convenient for them against a conservative. Guess who was financing the feminists at this time? Playboy. Playboy Magazine. Now, maybe in your past to realize what Playboy was especially doing in the 60s and 70s, but it wasn't pro-women. It wasn't pro-family. Here's a direct quote from the April 1974 Phyllis Schlafly report. Back at that time, Phyllis Schlafly wrote this, quote, "The February issue of Playboy Magazine published a letter from ERA Central telling how the lobbying headquarters for ERA is, quote, deeply indebted to the Playboy Foundation, and stating further that the ERA Central would probably not be operating at the present level without Playboy's help," end quote. What you see on the screen right here is an image of Playboy Magazine that it was included in the Phyllis Schlafly report, or what Playboy did in the sponsorship. You can see the proof of what was happening. You see, Phyllis Schlafly backed up her claim and all her claims with facts. What would ERA do? Who was actually funding this effort? What was the impact? And the fact is, it was a push to give immoral men and women more control and more dominance in our lives in America. ERA was always and all about power for the federal government. You know, Phyllis Schlafly was always careful when she was out speaking and teaching and writing to refer to Section 2 of the ERA. Section 2 of the ERA gave all the power to enforce the Equal Rights Amendment to the federal government. This means that the feds will be in charge of every aspect of that would touch the ERA, whether it's family law, marriage, divorce, as we mentioned earlier, all girls schools, all girls sports, all those things. It'd be the feds in charge. You know, why would we want, especially in this modern moment, we can see it, why would we want more federal power, especially to decide what equal means if the ERA passed? Look, Jill Ruckelshaus and other establishment Republican types, they pushed for the ERA, they pushed for pro-abortion policies. They were pushing the big government globalist vision that they had. And it failed. But it didn't completely fail until Donald Trump defeated it in 2016. It hasn't changed today. You see them coming out, you see them pushing for it. But the fact is, we know they admitted it. What they really want is power, not equality. You know, Mrs. America was finally right. They got one thing right. ERA is not about equality. It's about power. They finally admitted that amidst all the other lies they were saying. You know, Phyllis Schlafly, she defeated the feminists, the Democrats, even the establishment Republican types like Jill Ruckelshaus against all odds. Phyllis Schlafly and her band of volunteers and grassroots army, they did win, and they beat back all of that. But Phyllis did something that Hollywood doesn't seem to understand. She didn't beat the ERA and gain power for herself. No, she empowered others. She empowered her grassroots eagles. She empowered all Americans, especially to understand the Constitution and what it really means. You know, that's what Phyllis Schlafly did. That's what she was about. That's why she's the real Mrs. America. Now listen, be sure to like and share and subscribe right here to this video. Please pass this video on to others. They should know the truth. They should know what's really going on with the real Mrs. America, Phyllis Schlafly. And go to realmrsamerica.com. Check out all the photographs and testimonials and the rest we have stacked up there. It's so important. We'll be back with another fact check. We've got to do more. Stay tuned.